This video is sponsored by HelloFresh, if you can believe that. Cobra Kai is a bit of a miracle. Is that too much? Is that a crazy thing to say? What do you think, Mrs. LaRusso?
It's a karate miracle!
Well shit, you heard it here first, folks. It really is the best possible thing that could have come from a Karate Kid cult fan interpretation, so passé it became a running bit on How I Met Your Mother.
I hate Ralph Macchio!
I watched the first season more or less against my will, which was probably the only scenario in which I could get past the oversaturated YouTube-read original aesthetic, which was not aided by the writing. Or so I thought. There's an uncanny out-of-touchness the show has. Nails on a chalkboard humor that, coupled with the visual approach, feels like a Dhar Mann sketch. It feels like an overly sentimental after-school special that doesn't take place in the real world. Probably because the very premise of the show had been the basis of fan fiction for years. My hate watch continued into the last few episodes of the season, and then something changed. The heroes we've been following turn out to be evil, subverting the subversion the show is founded on, and all these atrocious qualities are suddenly in service of indoctrination akin to the 4chan alt-right pipeline. The visual language of the show mimics Facebook propaganda in the same way so many other shows have fallen in love with sitcom pastiche, but instead of putting on a genre affectation just to break its walls down in text, Cobra Kai commits wholeheartedly, even after it was handed over to Netflix, drawing a connection between the karate world the show turns into a central metaphor and the online spaces that affect its target audience. After this simple but effective reversal in Season 1, the show maintains its framework and builds up a Game of Thrones caliber web of morals and allegiances, where we have skin in the game on all sides. Despite the behavioral critiques, the show goes to surprisingly successful lengths to make sure we see where everyone is coming from, which I imagine stemmed from the desire to combat any more Johnny was the good guy all along readings, but opens up a surprisingly nuanced world for how morally blunt force the after-school special thing typically is. And once we're genuinely invested, the show's hideous aesthetic remains effective in how tactile the violence and ideological battles feel. Every time they flash back to the original movies, it's undeniable how much better they look and sound than Cobra Kai. But speaking as someone who's only seen the first movie, the violence there feels very controlled, mostly consisting of schoolyard bullying and rule-based tournament karate. I guess things escalate in the later movies, but the world of Cobra Kai is one where people are fighting for their lives at any given moment. And even though it seems juvenile that so much animosity and rivalry is between feuding after-school karate classes, there are real stakes. There's less contrast between tone and physicality in the movies, specifically because there's more contrast in the image. The fact that Cobra Kai is shot like a Target commercial means that basic TV-14 action choreography and sound design go a long way. But this is just fuel for the ever-expanding cast to undergo and reenact that pipeline, which itself is in service of the more universal pathos of fatherhood and mentorship. As the show's progressed, it's had some pitfalls not unlike the direction Game of Thrones went in. Kreese's presence meant there was an unambiguous bad guy to soften the ambiguity between Daniel and Johnny, and then once the show starts to sympathize with Kreese a little bit, Silver is brought on as the new big bad, and there's an ongoing sense that there's always a bigger fish. Once Daniel and Johnny team up, all the principal characters start shifting toward the good side, also like Game of Thrones, but there are only so many ways to twist the knife and come up with contrivances for the two to keep feuding, and this is likely the only way to achieve a sense of finality on the horizon. I honestly thought 3 seasons was all the show had in it, that it would putter out by season 4. But somehow the show keeps kicking. This is mainly due to how comprehensively the show is able to bring back its legacy characters. Cobra Kai is probably the one show that I'm okay with giving us extensive flashbacks to older scenes to explain who everyone is. And I feel like this gets the pass to bring people back, unlike Star Wars, for instance, because these people don't really hold any pop cultural currency. There's not exactly a fan base the show's catering to that's going, oh shit, it's Jessica from the Karate Kid Part 3. I mean, I'm sure there's some Karate Kid sequel heads out there, but this feels more like closing the circuit of the Karate Kid lore more so than fan service. In this scenario, neatly tying the Cobra Kai backstory of how Daniel and Amanda met to the world of the movies. Star Wars also has an essentially infinite world to explore and keeps bringing back the same unimaginative locations and characters, whereas the Karate Kid is a fairly niche world, for which it makes sense that there are these key players who become relevant again. So in one direction, you have people from the past coming back, and there's always a bigger fish. But in the other direction, the show also keeps introducing new characters who are organically incorporated into the fold, and they keep up the cycles of parental failure. It's like the shepherd tone, looping the same progression over and over, but in a way that appears to be constantly escalating. In this sense, there's also always a smaller fish. Robbie and Miguel become the new Johnny and Daniel, Kenny and Anthony become the new Robbie and Miguel, and we watch history repeat itself while still paving new revelations for each higher generation. And the show is just as comprehensive with these original characters as it is with the legacy characters. Anthony drops out of the show for like 2 seasons. I almost started to think they were pulling a That 70s Show and pretending he never existed. But they find a way to bring him back with a narrative that organically repeats the cycle by involving Robbie again and closing the circuit. Robbie fails Kenny like Johnny failed Robbie, like Kreese failed Johnny, like Silver failed Kreese. Kyler's also gone for a while and then brought back, though he's probably the most underwritten character in the show, and they take him in a direction this season that's just embarrassing to watch. And even Aisha, who's still gone, at least gets a moment to address her absence from the rest of the show. Even the cars in this show come back and get repurposed and reflect that sense of no stone left unturned. It's the kind of situation where everyone wins. The writers want to bring back as many people as possible. Everyone wants a piece of the pie because who wouldn't want to be part of this very successful Netflix show? And these aren't exactly A-listers. And then the result of bringing these people back is the show is more commercially successful and has more narrative fuel, and is thus able to bring more people back and keep fueling itself. It's cheesy in a way that mimics those Facebook videos I discussed, which is ironically in touch in a roundabout way, but the source material is also 80s cheese, so no one expects to take it seriously anyway. And then because there's such a low success bar, it's even more impressive when the show actually puts this sprawling cast in service of something thematically cogent, playing with duologies in a way that's compelling on its own, but also ties into the duology the world of karate revolves around.
We represent 2 opposing philosophies coming together and finding a common ground when none seemed possible.
This could have been a sandbox show, mashing all these elements together, but the writing really goes above and beyond the Call of Duty, emulsifying each new element into the dish, if you will. And speaking of emulsification, HelloFresh is the champion of weeknight meals. I love cooking, but I always dread the prospect of lugging all the groceries I need back to my place, mainly because I'm so bad at budgeting what I actually need for a recipe and spend the next week scrounging for ways to use up all the excess scallions I have, because scallions are always sold in quantities too large for me to get through, and then I build up all this food waste and hate myself for it and swear off cooking and then spend more money eating out. HelloFresh solves that. You get exactly as much scallion as you need, along with everything else, delivered to your door exactly when you design to best fit your schedule, providing meals up to 72% cheaper than eating out or buying groceries, and you can feel good not just about your wallet but your sustainability. HelloFresh cuts down on at least 25% food waste and provides completely recyclable packaging, and for what it's worth, the food is pretty damn good. I'm actually not even required to say that, but I was pretty blown away. I also got to do that thing I always see the YouTube chefs do, so that was fun. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code TJW65 for 65% off plus free shipping. That's a hefty percent if you ask me. Anyway, there's just something for everyone in this show, and somehow 5 seasons deep, the show still has legs. From here on out, I'm gonna get into season 5 spoilers. This season opens with a little 2-parter about Miguel's trip to meet his dad in Mexico, which recalls Daniel's arc in Okinawa. You could argue it's filler, but it culminates in this powerful moment for Miguel, a very strong push-and-pull relationship with Johnny and Robbie warring inside of him, that I think is a much more successful execution of this sort of contrived beat from the end of season 4. It's also a bit of an interlude from the typical Cobra Kai hijinks to give us a more genre-based one-shot, so to speak. Johnny and Robbie have a specific mission as effective buddy cops, Miguel gets caught up in this underworld, and we still get some progression back home as Daniel and Chosen play out a Departed-esque infiltration, complete with strategizing dialogue transitioning into narration over the plan being carried out. And the show has fun putting its characters into these genre antics. We expectedly get some classic Mexico color grading, which, for an already oversaturated show, reaches a point where it looks like they straight up poured Mountain Dew into the matte box. Call it a guilty pleasure. But I have no guilt enjoying farce like female body inspector shirts playing off with real consequence. I will say though, the show has always taken steps to try and be respectful of the cultures it's representing, often doing so by explicitly showing someone, usually Johnny, being disrespectful. But so often they back themselves into a corner trying to tackle these themes in a naive way that Johnny himself might write into a script, and they inevitably inevitably have to airlift themselves out of these scenarios. So with this Mexico arc, they clearly wanted to show that Miguel is going into dangerous, crime-infested territory, but in order to circumvent the reading that this is a generalization of Mexico or Mexican people, they make the petty criminals Australians who are just hanging out in Mexico. A close call. The color grading doesn't really do them any favors in this regard, but I think they got themselves out of that one. Later on, they find themselves in a similar scenario. These truckers confront Daniel for being a rich elite, and they instigate a fight with him, and in order to avoid the optics of our rich hero beating up the working class, he gets rescued from the scene. Obviously, Cobra Kai isn't a leftist text or anything, but there has always been an element of Daniel as a bit of a class traitor, who's essentially switched roles with Johnny after being the working class underdog in the original movie. This worked when Daniel had an antagonistic role in season 1, spending all his time at country clubs and whatnot, but since he's essentially become a good guy again, there's been very little reckoning with his position. And that of course makes him a more morally complicated character, but this scene with the truckers is the first time the inherent drama in that dynamic is even hinted at, and it's dropped so unceremoniously. Again, it's not like the arc of the show is for everyone to achieve class consciousness and use karate to start the revolution, even though they do set up the expansion of Cobra Kai as a bit of a capitalist critique. But it does make you wonder about the show's stance on all of this, especially considering the territory it delves into with Anthony and Kenny, and Robbie's speech about retaliation going too far. But anyway, Cobra Kai takes on Mexico. Miguel is taken to a fighting arena, where Robbie and Johnny have to do some real fighting, and this setting is likely a commentary on different fighting styles in different parts of the world, but it also culminates in this moment of opportunism from Robbie, which highlights how the show manages to communicate relationships via the fighting styles. Robbie went from street opportunism to Miyagi self-defense and honor to jail/Cobra Kai opportunism, back to Miyagi-Do. But here he's demonstrating the formalist discipline of karate with a less deplorable opportunism that rings Eagle Fang, communicating that he is letting in Johnny's influence and teachings, mending that relationship. The show isn't exactly subtle about this approach in general, especially later on.
Sensei Deguchi is real cryptic like Mr. LaRusso, but aggressive like Sensei Lawrence.
It's like the hardest part of both styles.
But the fact that it's there at all, and thematically coherent no less, is impressive. I also appreciate how the show gives everyone their due diligence in the arena. Everyone on this show is a capable fighter who gets their moment, but also everyone takes a beating at some point, rejecting the fast and furious MO of making everyone invincible. Not only do they take beatings, but the fact that most of them are kind of losers makes their victories feel like a sense of validation rather than ego flexing. And if it does reach that point, the character is then villainized. The reason Robbie has this pepper is from a scene where he's in a hot pepper eating competition, which unsurprisingly takes a pretty low bite out of Hot Ones, knowing the show's audience.
Mom and I watch Hot Ones on YouTube.
But this scene is what cemented what I've felt for years about the show's uncanny Dar mannerism, taking a lot from Twin Peaks Season 3. A return to our beloved characters 20-something years later, who aren't framed in the same endearing light we're used to. The whole thing has an overlit digital sheen with uncanny dialogue. Home decor looks like it came from a stock model home catalog, even when Johnny gets his shit together in text.
It actually looks like a functioning adult lives here now.
Physical actions like drinking are otherworldly. The coffee cups in Twin Peaks never actually have anything in them. And look at this monster tequila pour. I mean shit, Miguel's even in episode 8 of The Return. Is there a purpose to this? I mean, probably not. I prefer my earlier interpretation of the visual language, but it is startling just how much overlap there is, and how much versatility that language actually has. The show's other big visual and narrative inspiration is the soap opera, and once we get back from Mexico, we sort of get back to the normal swing of things. The soapiest aspect of this season has to do with the on and off of Miguel and Sam's relationship, but this works because everyone on this show is also fucking toxic for no good reason. Miguel bitching out his mom and Sam flip-flopping on what she wants from Miguel, these two are at each other's throats at all times. The list goes on, but as it does, it inevitably must be addressed that this toxicity is, again, in service of karate as a behavioral critique, and how easy it is to adopt and pass on behaviors. The soap opera element is but one flavor of the show, though. I think every season has a bit of a segmented trajectory following the same structure, and the beauty of the show is that because the cast is so big, Whenever there's a lull in the A, B, and C plots, we're able to tap into the reserves and keep the momentum going. We start out with the big strokes, resolving cliffhangers and establishing threats to the karate world, checking in with Johnny and Daniel's relationships with their families. Then we move into romance subplots, which pave the way to schoolyard tensions, then corruption of friends, or the next generation of Cobra Kai, and then once the show's exhausted all these reserves, it resorts to flashbacks. Not flashbacks like scenes from previous movies, original flashbacks inventing new backstory, and it's here where the show usually loses some steam, around the middle of the season. But so far without fail, either because we start moving away from the middle again in the opposite direction and opening up the more important threads, or because the show is saving its best cards for the end, every season of this show has pulled through by the last couple episodes, either making the slogging middle bits pay off, or being enough of a return to form to forgive the slogging. This season, I think, actually does a much better job balancing the middle section. It's not without some slow moments. When they get back from Mexico, the chosen departed thing is essentially dropped, and after the climax of Miguel's inner conflict with Robbie, they unceremoniously make up in the middle of a random episode in the middle of the season. But sometimes the slower bits are utilized in service of the show's grander purpose. Since this is a summer vacation season, there's no schoolyard tension, so they have to find other avenues to keep that conflict going. And we get this pool episode that I think highlights some of the shortcomings and redemptive qualities of casting such a wide demographic net. This is obviously a very juvenile feud, which could be chalked up to mid-season slog or catering to their younger audience. After all, the reserves I mentioned earlier are typically the younger characters' arcs. But they weren't exactly catering to their younger audience when they were saying fuck in the opening episode. And likewise, I doubt the people who'd be excited about the fact that they say fuck in Cobra Kai now were very enthralled by this pool conflict. There's utility to this, though. The kind of world where people get this heated over a water slide seems to be cut from the same cloth as, say, a show where soda is used as a metaphor for alcohol. Just like karate here is a metaphor, or at least a vehicle, for ideology. Except in Cobra Kai, the kids do drink alcohol. And in a grander sense, no punches are really ever pulled in this show. I mean, Johnny drunk drives like it's nothing. Again, it's the clashing of Target commercial artifice and the seemingly real world of the source material, of what looks and sounds like a children's program, but contains adult content. And that incongruence is effective in conveying Cobra Kai's corruption, a sense of innocence that makes these invasive qualities all the more disturbing. That's pretty Twin Peaksy. There's also significantly less flashback this season, but I think the other thing that helps it fight off the mid-season slog is a moment that happens at exactly the end of episode 5. Just as I was tapping out with conflicts like the pool episode, and also wondering why we hadn't seen Kreese yet this season, we get a reveal with him and Tori, and spend a substantial time the rest of the season checking in with him and following his prison arc, like the show had been holding back on us, waiting to unleash this second half stamina. And not only is he back in full swing, but his arc leads to one of the craziest moments in the show. Maybe I'm pea-brained for thinking they actually killed Kreese for a minute there, but the show did a good enough job building him up as an old dog for me to buy it, and for the reveal to work, doing the most it can within the inherent sense of safety the show has. The main themes this season are cheating, which Tori's grappling with, and the idea of thinking like the snake, thinking like the enemy. Fertile ground for identity crisis, a la The Departed or Infernal Affairs, which plays into Cobra Kai's whole duology thing. Daniel sort of enters his flop era, which seems to be a consequence of the mind games Silver plays with him, and services the notion of him and Johnny constantly moving in opposite directions, Johnny getting his shit together this season. But I do think they could have played this downward spiral more into the idea of thinking like the snake, because it becomes rather divorced from that. It kind of mutates into to beat a monster we need a monster, which briefly hints at a Kreese redemption, but they pretty quickly back out of that. In fact, this moment seemed surprisingly against the show's MO, asserting Kreese as irredeemably evil, and Daniel and Johnny weaponizing Cobra Kai methodology against him when they talk so much game about being above that. This is mostly fine. The show is very good at making its repetitive redemptions not feel repetitive, but I get that they have to draw the line somewhere. But this moment made me realize how often the fights in this show are instigated by the good guys, which I guess harkens back to the Johnny was the good guy all along interpretation that sparked this show in the first place. So at least it's consistent. At this point, I might as well just get some of the remaining individual character stuff off my chest. Just like Kreese, Stingray comes back into the game halfway through the season, and even though he's only in 3 episodes, he's given some meat. He's got a pretty pivotal role this time around, and Paul Walter Hauser's always a great presence. I always forget he's in this show. Chosen gets a good portion of meat this season too, not with any particular character arc, but spearheading the movement forward, and being the agent that causes this team-up of previous Karate Kid villains turned good. Dimitri's noticeably absent for a lot of this season. I guess they justify it that he gets a summer job, but there are scenes it doesn't really make sense for him to not be in, which I imagine boils down to some sort of scheduling conflicts shooting this season. To be honest though, Dimitri's the one character who really got on my nerves, so having him in small doses wasn't really an issue. Hawk is kind of the epitome of this show overstaying its welcome. After a reasonable 4 seasons completing his arc, he's just hanging around without much to do here, but season 4 was kind of his season, and it speaks to the show's ability to bring in and shelf characters at will for whatever best suits the show's momentum. Sam's arc is a bit muddled. She sets out on a journey of self-actualization, which gets backtracked when plot necessitates Miyagi-Do's return, and I don't think they really spin it all that well for her. But again, I liked the soap opera qualities of her arc. Her thread does remind me though, this season seems to be trying to step on Stranger Things' toes or something. We've got a sensory deprivation tank launching a vision of oneself in a dark void, which I was willing to call a coincidence. Stranger Things didn't exactly invent that. But as soon as we got a scene where a D&D game incorporates Metallica into the fold, I started to feel like something dubious was up. Maybe it's an even bigger coincidence. I'm not gonna look any more into it. Feel free to theorize yourself. I guess the downside of a show jumping from generation to generation every time there's an inkling of a lull in what we're currently watching means they're just kind of avoiding the problem and not really confronting why there are these lulls in the first place. I mean, despite the broader sense of momentum the season has, zooming in on each character shows that a lot of them don't really have much to do. But it makes me think about how we compartmentalize what we watch. I've spoken at length about streaming and the binge model and seasonal self-containment at this point. I'll link to another video you can hear more about that in. But Cobra Kai is the kind of show you digest in seasons, so that broader momentum and the general overtones of the season are what we take in and really process, and it's not until sitting down and writing out each individual character's arc that sense of them having nothing to do really manifests itself. So I do wonder if, rather than being a tactic to avoid the problem, all that jumping around is actually a calculated decision taking into account how we perceive these seasons. I mean, it's the same reason ending on a high note after some bullshit in the middle is always more effective than being consistently strong throughout and blundering the ending. And most of these character qualms are pretty small hang-ups anyway, for a show that has not wavered in quality, and if anything has only gotten better, reducing the stuff I didn't like about past seasons, and doubling down on moments that are insane considering Cobra Kai's initial size and scope, particularly in the finale with the 2 fake-out deaths. Chosen surviving after this moment feels like a bit of a cheap shot, but Kreese pulling a Hannibal Lecter light really worked for me, especially because the show, rather than expanding with yet another villain, is finally retracting a bit and returning some of the power. So Silver getting locked up and Kreese on the loose means that the smaller fish has become the bigger fish once again. Tori, after her own departed double agent moment, is on the good side now, but we still have enough people to maintain some antagonism in Cobra Kai, though not a ton of major players. I feel like the show should reasonably only have one more season left in it. But then again, that's what I said 3 seasons ago, and in the show's own words,
if we're successful, Cobra Kai will go on forever.
Maybe they'll finally bring on Jaden Smith and bridge the 2 canons. I mean, really anything could happen on this show. But hey, that's where I'm at, you know? As always, let me know your thoughts. Where would you like to see the show go? Links in the description. Follow me. You know how it goes. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.